Barron Trump sat in a corner of the cafe, the sunlight streaming through the large windows casting warm patterns on his table. A book lay open before him, its pages slightly worn from frequent reading. The cafe hummed with life, soft conversations, the hiss of the espresso machine, and the gentle clinking of cups against saucers creating a tranquil symphony. Outside, the city bustled with its usual energy, a stark contrast to the peaceful atmosphere inside. People hurried along the sidewalks, cars honked in the distance, and a street musician strummed a mellow tune on his guitar. To anyone watching, it was an ordinary afternoon, but inside the cafe, a storm was quietly brewing. The door swung open, the jingle of the bell announcing the arrival of a man whose presence was anything but ordinary. His gaze swept the room, lingering on Barron for a moment too long. The teenager didn't look up, unaware of the stranger's focus. The man ordered a coffee but didn't move to a table. Instead, he stood by the counter, his eyes fixed on Barron, his expression hardening with each passing second. The cafe's atmosphere shifted slightly, the easy warmth giving way to an uneasy tension. Barron, immersed in his book, seemed oblivious to the brewing storm. But the man's clenched fists and furrowed brow hinted at something more, a confrontation that would shatter the calm of the quiet cafe and draw everyone's attention. The cafe door jingled as it swung open, drawing brief glances from the patrons before they returned to their conversations. The man who entered seemed out of place. His sharp, hurried movements clashed with the laid-back atmosphere. Dressed in a rumpled suit and carrying an air of tension, he scanned the room with a hawk-like intensity. His eyes stopped when they landed on Barron Trump, sitting near the window. Barron, engrossed in his book, appeared unaware of the stranger's penetrating stare, but to anyone observing, the man's gaze was unsettling, piercing, almost accusatory. He moved to the counter, ordered a coffee, and stood stiffly, ignoring the friendly smile of the barista. His focus remained locked on Barron, as though the young man's quiet presence offended him. Barron turned a page in his book, seemingly oblivious to the man's attention. The cafe, however, began to feel different. The soft clinking of cups seemed louder, conversations quieter, as if the tension emanating from the man rippled through the room. The stranger's coffee arrived, but he didn't sit. Instead, he lingered by the counter, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the cup. His eyes darted to Barron, then back to the steaming liquid in his hands, as though deciding his next move. The atmosphere grew thick with anticipation. Whatever the man was about to do, it was clear that the quiet harmony of the cafe was about to be disrupted in a way no one had expected. The cafe's peaceful hum shattered without warning. "Do you even know what your family has done?" The stranger's voice thundered across the room, ricocheting off the walls. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The clinking of spoons against cups ceased, and the steady whir of the espresso machine seemed to fade into silence. Every eye turned toward the man, now standing rigid near the counter, his glare fixed on Barron Trump. The barista, mid-pour, froze, a stream of milk suspended in midair as she stared at the unfolding scene. Barron, still seated by the window, slowly looked up from his book. His calm gaze met the stranger's fiery one. The tension in the room was almost tangible, thick and suffocating, as if the air itself had taken on the weight of the stranger's words. The man's face was flushed, his hands trembling as he pointed toward Barron. "You sit here reading while people suffer because of your family." His voice cracked with a mix of anger and something deeper, desperation perhaps. Around the cafe, patrons exchanged uneasy glances. Some looked away, unwilling to involve themselves, while others leaned forward, caught in the drama unfolding before them. The warm, inviting cafe had transformed into a stage for confrontation, and no one dared interrupt. Barron sat motionless, his expression unreadable. The silence that followed the outburst was deafening, the room bracing itself for whatever was about to come next. The stranger's footsteps echoed against the cafe's tiled floor as he strode toward Barron's table, his anger spilling out with each step. "You sit here like nothing's wrong, while people suffer because of your family," he spat, his voice rising above the stunned silence. His hand shot forward, pointing an accusatory finger at the young man who now had the full attention of everyone in the room. Barron Trump slowly closed his book, placing it neatly on the table. His expression remained calm, unreadable, even as the man loomed over him, his face flushed with frustration. The air in the cafe felt heavy, as if the collective breath of its patrons was being held in anticipation of Barron's reaction. The stranger's voice cracked as he continued, "Do you even care? Do you even know what it's like for people like us?" His trembling hand clenched into a fist, but he stopped short of any further movement, his anger meeting an immovable wall of Barron's composed demeanor. Without a word, Barron raised his gaze to meet the man's. His calm, steady eyes seemed to pierce through the chaos of the moment. He leaned forward slightly, his hands folded on the table as if inviting the man to sit. The cafe felt suspended in time. Every person in the room watched, waiting for Barron's response, unsure of what would come next. Whatever it was, they knew it would shape the outcome of this tense, unexpected confrontation. Barron Trump closed his book with deliberate care, the soft thud of the pages meeting the cover seeming louder in the hushed cafe. He looked up at the stranger towering over his table, his gaze steady and unflinching. There was no anger in his expression, no trace of fear, just a calm presence that felt almost disarming. "I'm sorry you feel that way," Barron said, his voice measured and soft, yet it carried through the silent room. "Can we talk about it?" The man froze, his accusatory finger faltering in midair. For a moment, the fury in his eyes flickered, replaced by confusion. He had expected an argument, defensiveness, or even fear. But not this. The unexpected composure of the teenager before him seemed to sap the heat from his anger. The cafe's patrons held their breath, their eyes darting between Barron and the stranger. The barista, still clutching a milk jug, watched intently, her gaze filled with both concern and curiosity. The man's shoulders slumped slightly, as if the weight of his own outburst had begun to settle on him. His trembling hand lowered and he stammered, I didn't mean." Barron gestured gently toward the empty chair across from him. "Please sit. I'd like to understand what's upsetting you." The tension in the room began to dissolve, replaced by a sense of cautious hope. Barron's calm and unexpected reaction had turned a confrontation into the possibility of dialogue, leaving everyone in awe of his grace under pressure. The cafe had always been a quiet sanctuary in the heart of the city. Tucked away on a side street, it had the kind of charm that drew in locals looking for a moment of peace amid the bustling chaos of the world outside. The soft hum of espresso machines, the clinking of cups, the occasional murmur of conversations. Everything about it whispered calm. On most days, it was a haven for writers, students, and retirees alike, each absorbed in their world, content to be surrounded by the comforting aroma of coffee beans. But on this particular morning, something was different. The usual serenity of the cafe was broken by a sudden outburst. It came from the back corner, where an older man sat alone, his hands wrapped tightly around a mug, his brow furrowed in frustration. His voice, low at first, began to rise. "Every damn time. It's the same thing," he shouted, the words cutting through the soft background noise. His face, lined with years of experience, twisted into a scowl as he continued, oblivious to the eyes now turning in his direction. "They don't listen. They never listen." The cafe fell silent, the tension in the room palpable. A few patrons glanced nervously at each other, unsure of what to do. It wasn't often that such an outburst occurred in this peaceful space. Most of the time, the occasional disagreements were quickly quelled. But this felt different. The anger in the man's voice, the intensity of his frustration, it was hard to ignore. At first, no one dared approach him. The young barista behind the counter, a nervous teenager named Emma, tried to carry on as if nothing was happening, but her eyes flickered toward the man from time to time. She wasn't sure how to handle the situation. She wasn't equipped for confrontations, especially with someone as visibly upset as the man was. But then, a voice broke through the tension. "I'm sorry, but what exactly are you so angry about?" It was soft, calm, but firm, like a steady hand reaching out in the chaos. A woman, probably in her early 30s, had stood up from her seat at the far end of the cafe and was walking toward the man. Her demeanor was unassuming, yet there was something about her presence that made her seem unafraid. She had long, dark hair that framed her face, and a warm, approachable expression that suggested understanding, not judgment. Man froze for a moment, his mouth still open in mid-rant as if he hadn't expected anyone to interrupt him. He stared at her, confusion and anger mixing in his eyes. "What's it to you?" He spat, his voice still harsh but not as sharp as before. The woman didn't flinch. Instead, she took another step forward, her gaze steady, her posture relaxed. "I'm just curious. You seem upset, and I'm wondering what's going on." For a long moment, the cafe was silent, everyone watching the exchange holding their breath. It wasn't every day that a stranger stepped in like this. But something in the woman's voice, the sincerity in her tone, seemed to reach the man in a way nothing else had. His hands trembled slightly as he set the mug down on the table with a soft clink. "They never listen," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "It's like they don't care. No matter how much I try to explain, they don't care. They just keep doing their thing like they know everything, and it's always the same damn thing. Why can't they just see it? Why can't they see what they're doing wrong?" The woman's expression softened, and she took another step closer. "It sounds like you've been carrying a lot of frustration for a while. Maybe they don't see things the way you do, but that doesn't mean they don't care. Sometimes people get so caught up in their own world, they don't realize how their actions affect others." The man looked at her for a moment, his chest rising and falling with each breath. It was clear that his anger was only part of the story. There was pain behind those words, a frustration that ran deeper than just a simple disagreement. The woman, sensing this, sat down at the table opposite him. "You want to talk about it?" she asked, her voice gentle but insistent. The man blinked as if he had to process the offer. He wasn't used to this. People actually listening, offering to hear him out instead of dismissing him or walking away. He looked around the room at the other patrons who were still observing, waiting. The silence in the cafe was almost deafening. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice quieter now, the edge of anger gone. "Yeah, I guess I do." And so, the conversation began. At first, the man spoke in fragments, his words tumbling out, mixed with frustration and regret. He talked about his son, how they had grown apart over the years, how their once close relationship had soured. He talked about the arguments, the misunderstandings, the feeling that no matter how much he tried to explain, his son just couldn't see where he was coming from. As he spoke, the woman listened attentively, her eyes never leaving him. Every now and then, she would nod in understanding, offering small, thoughtful responses that seemed to encourage him to keep going. Slowly, as the minutes passed, the man's voice softened further, his shoulders less tense, his posture more relaxed. The outburst that had started so angrily had transformed into something deeper, a conversation, a connection. "I just don't know what to do anymore," the man confessed. "I've tried everything. I don't know how to fix it. It feels like I'm invisible to him." The woman's gaze remained steady. "Have you tried telling him how you feel? Really telling him? Not just about what's wrong, but about how much you care? Sometimes people need to hear that, even if they seem like they don't." The man paused, his gaze dropping to the table. "I don't know. I don't know if he'd listen." "I think it's worth trying," she said. "Sometimes people just need to hear the truth from the heart. Maybe it's not too late to bridge the gap." The man stared at her, a mix of disbelief and hope flickering in his eyes. For the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of possibility, something other than frustration. They continued to talk, the woman offering advice, but more importantly, she offered a space for the man to speak freely, something that apparently no one else had done in years. She didn't rush him, didn't offer quick fixes. Instead, she let him process his emotions at his own pace. Slowly, he began to speak more openly, peeling back the layers of resentment and hurt that had built up over time. By the time he finished, the initial anger had long since dissipated. He looked tired, yes, but also lighter. He was no longer the man who had stormed into the cafe venting his frustration. Instead, he was someone who had been heard, who had had the chance to voice his pain and his hopes. I think I can try," he said, almost to himself, as if the idea was just now settling into his mind. "I think I can try again." The woman smiled softly, her eyes warm with understanding. "Sometimes that's all we can do. Try." He nodded, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his lips. There was still a long road ahead of him, But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of hope. As the man stood to leave, he turned to the woman. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I didn't expect this today." She nodded, standing as well. "I'm glad I could help. Sometimes all it takes is someone to listen." With that, the man walked out of the cafe, his steps slower now, more measured, as if he carried a weight that had lightened just a little. The patrons who had been watching the scene unfold exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of curiosity and relief. The atmosphere in the cafe had shifted. What had started as a tense, uncomfortable moment had blossomed into a quiet, heartfelt conversation. The anger that had filled the air was replaced with something gentler, a sense of understanding, of connection. And in that moment, as the usual hum of the cafe resumed, the patrons who had witnessed the exchange shared a silent understanding. It was a reminder that sometimes, all it takes is a change in perspective to turn a moment of frustration into one of healing. Sure. Here's the second part of the story, continuing the narrative and expanding on the themes introduced in the first part. The days that followed the man's unexpected outburst at the cafe seemed to carry a subtle shift in the air. It was as if the cafe, once a place where time moved quietly and predictably, had become a haven for deeper conversations and reflections. Something in the interaction between the man and the woman had changed not just him, but also the people who had witnessed it. Emma, the barista, had found herself thinking about that morning long after it ended. She had never been one to engage with customers on a personal level. Her job was simple: make the coffee, take the orders, and keep things moving smoothly. But the way the woman had so calmly intervened in the man's outburst, listening, understanding, and offering a space for him to share, had struck a chord with Emma. She had seen the man's frustration when he walked in. She'd heard the way his voice broke through the calm of the cafe, and it had unsettled her. But what followed, the transformation that took place in that brief conversation, was something she had never witnessed before. She hadn't even realized how much she needed that lesson in patience, in empathy, until it had unfolded right in front of her. That evening, Emma sat at home with a cup of tea, reflecting on the events of the day. She had always prided herself on being a listener, but there was a difference between listening and truly hearing someone. She realized that sometimes it wasn't enough to nod and smile, or even offer a few comforting words. Sometimes people needed more. They needed the space to speak their truth, to feel seen and understood. A few days later, as Emma was cleaning the counter, the door to the cafe chimed again, and the same man walked in. He looked different, lighter, less burdened. His shoulders were no longer hunched in frustration, and the storm of anger that had clouded his eyes was gone. Instead, there was a quiet calm about him, a gentleness in his step. The patrons who had been in the cafe the day of the outburst exchanged quiet glances, but no one said anything. The tension that had once filled the air had long dissipated, leaving only the lingering memory of a moment that had altered the course of a day, if not a life. The man approached the counter, his eyes meeting Emma's as he stood in line. She smiled at him, a small but genuine expression, and he returned it with a nod. There was no need for words. She could see it in his face, the gratitude, the quiet resolve. He ordered a coffee, the same one he had ordered the first time he came in, and when she handed him his cup, he paused. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said softly, his voice steady but carrying a depth that hadn't been there before. "For what you did the other day. I didn't expect it, but I think it helped more than I realized." Emma blinked in surprise. "I didn't do much," she said, feeling a bit awkward. "I just made your coffee." The man shook his head. "No, it wasn't that. It was the woman. She listened. She didn't judge me, didn't dismiss me. And she made me realize something. Maybe I've been so caught up in my own pain that I haven't seen the bigger picture." He took a deep breath, his expression thoughtful. "I went home that day and called my son. I told him everything. The anger, the frustration, but also how much I cared. And for the first time in a long time, we had a real conversation. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start." Emma felt a warm rush of emotion. "That's amazing," she said. I'm really glad you were able to reach out." The man nodded, his gaze now filled with a quiet gratitude. "You know, I've been coming to this cafe for years and I've never really talked to anyone here. But that day, that woman, she made me realize that sometimes all it takes is someone to listen. I don't know if I would have had the courage to reach out to my son if it wasn't for that moment." Emma watched him for a moment, silently acknowledging the weight of his words. She didn't know if he had realized it yet. But his gratitude wasn't just for the woman who had spoken with him. It was for the simple act of being heard. And that, she realized, was a rare gift. As the man turned to leave, he paused at the door and looked back. "Thank you again," he said, his voice more earnest than Emma had ever heard it. "You've got a good place here." With that, he left, and Emma stood behind the counter, her mind racing. She couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in the cafe, not just for the coffee or the atmosphere, but for the way it had become a place where people could find themselves, whether through an overheard conversation or a quiet, heartfelt exchange. Weeks passed, and the cafe continued its usual rhythm. Emma had grown more confident in her role, but more importantly, she had grown as a person. She had started paying closer attention to the people around her, the ones who came in day after day, the ones who never said much, and the ones who needed more than a cup of coffee. And it was as if she had begun to see them, really see them, for the first time. Then, one rainy afternoon, the woman who had helped the man returned. She entered the cafe with a small, worn umbrella in one hand and a warm smile on her face. Emma recognized her immediately and greeted her with a smile. As weeks passed, the cafe's transformation became more evident. It wasn't just the physical ambiance or the menu changes, it was the energy of the place. It had become a space not just for quiet moments, but for conversation and understanding. The patrons who frequented the cafe seemed more open to one another, less guarded, more willing to share a part of themselves. And the staff, too, had changed. Emma had become more engaged with the customers, recognizing the importance of listening, of being present, of seeing the small moments that others might overlook.